Hi, thank you very much. It's good to be here. Good to see all of you. So what I want to talk about today is guidance, because it is, for my money, the single most important part of managing people. And by guidance, I mean praise and criticism. And it's important, obviously, to give it, but it's even more important to get it. You want to know when your people think you're going in the wrong direction. But the thing that's going to give you more leverage than anything else is learning how to encourage it between the people who work for you, because there's more of them than there are of you. When guidance is great, I describe it as radical candor. And in order to explain to you what I mean by radical candor, I'm going to tell you a story about a time that my boss criticized me. I had just joined Google and was going to give a presentation with Gokul, actually, to the founders and the CEO about how the AdSense business was doing. And for me, working at Google, it wasn't just a new job. It was actually like the resurrection of a dream. I had started a software company 4 years before that had failed, unfortunately, recently. And part of the reason why I started that company was that I wanted to create a workplace that was like a bullshit-free zone, where people actually loved the work they did and at least enjoyed working together. And so it was very sad to me when the company failed for a number of reasons, including that one. And the first time I stepped on Google's campus for interviews, the first time I went there, the joy that people took in the work that they did felt almost palpable to me. And the respect that people showed, people like Gokul and Greg, showed each other it was almost a tangible thing. And I was really curious to understand how the leaders at Google had pulled this off. Did you have to have the world's greatest business model and money spouting from the earth? Or were there some things that any of us could do? Luckily, there's some things that any of us can do, and I'll tell you about those today. So anyway, that's a long-winded way of saying this was an important meeting to me. I wanted to make a good impression. And so I walked in feeling a little nervous, and happily, the AdSense business was on fire. And when Greg and Gokul and I told Larry, Sergey, and Eric how many publishers we had added over the last few months, Eric almost fell off his chair and said, "What resources can we give you to help you continue this amazing success?" So I sort of felt like the meeting went okay. After it was over, my boss said, "Why don't you walk back to my office with me?" And I said, "Sure," sort of expecting a little bit of a victory lap. And she started telling me about the 4 or 5 things she liked about the presentation, how impressed she was with how the business was doing. But I was getting more and more nervous as we were walking, because I sort of had a feeling the other shoe was about to drop. But I had no idea what I had done wrong, so this was an uncomfortable moment. And finally, she said, "But," and I sort of held my breath, "you said a lot." And I was like, "Oh, no big deal. I know I do that." It didn't really seem like, who cared if I said a lot when I had a tiger by the tail? So she said, "Was it because you were nervous?" "No, nervous, not me." And then she said, "Would it help if Google hired a speaking coach for you so that you could learn not to do this?" And I said, "I'm really busy. It just doesn't seem like the most important thing in the world." And she said, "Kim, when you do that thing with your hand, I can tell I'm not really getting through to you. I'm going to have to be more clear here. When you say every third word, it makes you sound stupid." That got my attention. Now, a lot of people would have said that it wasn't very nice to say that I sounded stupid, but in fact, it was the kindest thing that she could possibly have done for me. If she hadn't said it just that way, I would have kept blowing her off. I wouldn't have addressed the problem, and it would have, what a silly thing to let trip you up at a job. I still do it, but not as much. It would be a total state of paralysis if I hadn't gone to that coach that Cheryl sent me to. So how was Cheryl, it sounds like kind of a simple thing to say, you need to correct something, but it very rarely happens. So what I did was I tried to operationalize what my boss was so good at so that I could do it and so that I could teach the people who worked for me to do it and now teach all of you to do it. So I'm going to boil it down to sort of a very simple framework. On the vertical axis is what I call the give a damn axis. And part of the reason why Cheryl was able to say to me so bluntly, "You sounded stupid," was that I knew that she cared personally about me. She had done 1,000 things that showed me that. When I first moved to California from New York and I didn't know anybody, I didn't have any friends, she invited me to join her book group. When I had a family member who got very sick, she was totally clear with me that my first responsibility was to my family and I should just leave and go and deal with that. And she had me covered at work. And she did that not just for me, but for all of the people who worked for her. So caring personally is going to make it much easier to do the next thing that you have to do as a good boss, which is to be willing to piss people off. Colin Powell said, leadership often means being willing to piss people off. So the other thing that Cheryl had to do was to be willing to challenge me directly. Now, this is something that a lot of us are very reluctant to do. Since the time we learned to speak, our parents told us some version of, if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say it at all, right? Anybody ever get told that? And now, as soon as you become a boss for the first time, or even if you've already been managing people for 25 years, it's now your job to say it. And I would argue it's not just your job, it's actually your moral obligation. John Stuart Mill explains it very well. He says that the source of everything respectable in man, either as an intellectual or as a moral being, is that his errors are corrigible. The whole strength and value of human judgment depends on the one property that it can be set right when it is wrong. So it was not just my boss's job to tell me that I sounded stupid. It was actually her moral obligation to me, right? So that is what, at the intersection of caring personally and challenging directly, is radical candor, right? So how can you be radically candid? If an acronym helps you, radical candor is HIP. It's humble, it's helpful, it's immediate, it's in person, it's in private if it's criticism, in public if it's praise, and it doesn't personalize. My boss didn't say, you are stupid or you're a moron. She just said, you sounded stupid when you said right? There's a big difference between the two. However, that takes a lot of work, right? It takes a lot of intentionality in your day. So if you can't offer radical candor, the second best thing you can do is to be an asshole. Now, let me be totally clear. None of you is shooting for second best. I am second to none in my dislike of jerks, so I'm not advocating that you all become a bunch of raging assholes. I just want to say it can be even worse. So we've all worked with these jerks. We've all worked with jerks. There was one person who we worked with, who we sort of affectionately named the biggest asshole in Silicon Valley. So we'll call him Basby. So the real problem with Basby happened when he had an advisor who was trying to help him sort of brush up his reputation. And unfortunately, this advisor didn't teach him how to care personally. The advisor just advocated that he quit challenging people so directly. So he sort of rolled on over to an even worse place, manipulative insincerity, right? So he would do things like he decided he would go on a listening tour, and he was going to hear from everybody what they liked and what they didn't like. And at first, people were kind of happy to have an audience with Basby. Why? I don't know. They should have learned. But anyway, they were. But then his silence was deafening, and it became, we all started sort of wondering, were we just wasting our time putting together all these presentations? And then we began to get the sense that it was even worse than that. We were going to be punished for saying what we really thought. And in fact, it became very clear that we were when Basby marched into a friend of mine's office, hit the speaker button, and said, call up George, ask George what he really thinks of me, but don't tell him I'm standing here. You're like, you think you leave that behind in middle school, but no, this was one of the highest paid executives in the world. Anyway, now, the good news is that the BASFs of the world are actually pretty rare. I've only in my whole career known 2 people that I would sort of elevate to this level of annoyance. The vast majority of management mistakes happen in a quadrant that I call ruinous empathy. And so to explain what I mean by ruinous empathy, I'll tell you a sad story about probably the worst moment of my whole career. So there was this guy who was working for me, we'll call him Bob. And Bob was charming. He had this sort of quirky sense of humor. We were doing one of those off-sites, and there was some stupid get-to-know-you exercise, and he made us all stop doing it. And he went around the room, and he said, "What candy did your parents use to potty train you?" Oddly, we all remembered. And for the rest of the year, every time there was a tense moment in a meeting, Bob would whip out the right piece of candy for the right person and break the tension totally. So I don't know, maybe I have a weird sense of humor, but I found this endearing, and I really liked Bob. So I really wanted to be nice to Bob. The problem was that Bob was absolutely terrible at his job. And he kind of knew it, and he would come to me, and he would say, "Hey, I'm worried," and I would sort of try to reassure him and buck him up. And after about 10 months of this, it became clear to me that if I didn't address the situation with Bob, I was going to lose 2 or 3 of my very best people. So having tried to be nice to Bob for the last 10 months, having never criticized him because I was trying to be nice, I was now sitting in front of Bob firing him. Not so nice after all. And when I told him, Bob pushed his chair back and he looked at me and he said, "Why didn't you tell me?" And as that question was sort of rolling around like a bowling ball in my head, he said, "Why didn't anyone tell me? I thought you all liked me." And so I realized I had failed Bob in 6 very important ways. The kind of praise that I gave him was like a head fake. It gave him a bunch of false reassurances. I never criticized him when it was not just my job, but my moral obligation to have done so. I never asked Bob what he thought, because I had kind of written him off, frankly, and even though I liked him. And I had failed to create the kind of culture in which everyone in the company would tell Bob when he was going off the tracks. So now I had failed to do my job well, and as a result, Bob was losing his job because of it. One of the worst things about managing people is that you're going to learn your most important lessons and you're going to make your most important mistakes on the backs of other people. So it's really important to learn quickly and to try to learn from other people's mistakes. Not only did I learn it on Bob's back, I also lost $35 million of my investors' money as the company failed, but I learned some very important lessons which you are now going to get for free. So, 4 things you can do. This is why First Round Capital likes me. So, 4 things you can do to avoid ever being in the situation that I was in with Bob. The first one is impromptu guidance, and this is probably the most important one. So take this 2 by 2, explain it to your teams, draw it, stick it near your desk, get a couple of stickers, 1 color for praise, 1 color for criticism, and get people to put stickers where they think your last interaction was. You'll be surprised how clear people will be with you about how they feel about the kind of guidance that you're giving them. And when you're open to sort of have your guidance be rated by your people, just the visual cue will sort of push you towards radical candor, will push you towards the right direction. Now, the next thing you can do is to make backstabbing impossible. This is one of the most important things you can do to sort of foster a culture of guidance between the people who work for you. So another mistake. I did do some things right in my career, but I learned more from the mistakes, so I'll tell you about those. So I had 2 guys working for me. We'll call them Charlie and Douglas. Charlie and Douglas hated each other. Charlie thought Douglas was a bozo. Douglas thought Charlie was a sleazebag. And so Charlie would come to me, complain about Douglas. I would sort of understand what Douglas did wrong. I would try to play shuttle diplomat. I thought I was Kissinger. I didn't realize I was merely their boss. And I would go talk to Douglas. Douglas would then complain to me about Charlie. Charlie would look and say, I wonder if they're talking about me. And of course, we were. And so I created, by sort of trying to play go-between, the very kind of toxic political environment that I was trying to avoid. So what should I have done instead? It would have been much better instead if, when Charlie came to me to talk about Douglas, I said, "Did you talk to Douglas?" And if he said no, I should have said, "Go talk to Douglas directly," without me in the room. And then I should have made the commitment to both of them. If you can't work it out, come to me and I'll help you come up with a solution. But come to me together. Don't come to me separately. And I was talking to a leader once who said he would always try to come up with the very worst possible solution for both people when they came to him, because he didn't want to hear about it. The problem is that if you don't genuinely try to come up with something that works for both, if conflicts become too difficult to resolve in your organization, then people will avoid them. They won't challenge each other directly. So I really try to make a good faith effort to help them find the solution and help them find it quickly. So that's thing number 2. Thing number 3, you've got to make it easier to speak truth to power, right? So if you are a manager of managers, you need to make sure that the people working for the people who work for you can raise problems as they arise, if the people working for you are not, in fact, good bosses or haven't learned, right? Now, this is can be tricky because you can create a situation in which you are you're sort of chopping your people off at the knees and encouraging people to be boss killers. And that's not really what you're trying to do here. So the thing that I learned to do was to have a meeting called a sort of a skip level meeting, or a manager feedback session, or whatever you want to call it. And so if Scott worked for me and he had 10 direct reports, I would explain to Scott, I'm going to go meet with your direct reports without you, but this is going to be a meeting that's going to help you. So I would get Scott comfortable. And then I would go meet with Scott's direct reports. And I would explain to them that the purpose of the meeting was to help Scott learn how to be a better manager, which was good for Scott and also good for them. The meeting was going to be not for attribution. In other words, I would tell Scott what everybody said, but not who said it. Not because I wanted to foster secrecy, but because I wanted to help get the information out there. I also would explain that over time, it shouldn't be necessary for it to be not for attribution, but we were going to start that way. And then I would take notes in the meeting. I wouldn't bring in an admin to take notes. I would take the notes myself. That's a very important way to show people that you're listening, and it's also a very important way to get corrections. And I would tell people at the end of this meeting, as soon as it's over, not an hour later, we're not going to have time to go back and edit because we're all too busy. As soon as this meeting is over, I'm sharing it with Scott. I'm sharing this document with Scott. And then that sort of had a way of focusing the conversation. In order to make sure that it didn't become just a gripe session, I would force people to prioritize issues. I would say, changing behavior is hard. You can't ask Scott to change his whole personality as a result of this one 45-minute meeting. Like, what do you want him to do? What are the one or two things you want him to do? Then I would talk to Scott after the meeting, make sure Scott understood what the issues were, and get Scott to come up with some specific things, very specific, concrete things he could do, and make sure he did those things and not just communicated them to the team, but over-communicated them to the team. So that was a way of helping avoid the situation that all of you, I'm sure, have been in, where stuff is happening down in your organizations that sort of makes your skin crawl, and you wonder, how could this have happened? Why didn't I know about it? But you want to learn about those things in a way that supports the managers who are working for you. Now, last but not least, You should listen to what you were told on your last flight. Put your own oxygen mask on first. You can't possibly give a damn about other people if you don't give a damn about yourself. At one point, when I was having a very stressful period in my career, I realized the most important thing I could do for my team was not hire great people. It was not to raise a lot of money. It was actually to take a run every morning. This was not about work-life balance. Like, that run actually was part of my job, because I couldn't show up and be my best self if I didn't exercise. And I had to exercise outside. Going to the gym, I found depressing. So I got pretty religious. I was living in New York at the time, about running around the reservoir every morning. There was one period that was especially stressful. Things were not going as well as we wanted them to go. And there was a terrible thunderstorm, like lightning, and I thought, this is a crazy day to run, but I got to do it. I took this commitment to myself very seriously. So I was out running around the reservoir. There's usually hundreds of people. There was only one other nut running that morning. And as I got closer to him, I realized it was my co-founder. So a lot of things were going wrong, but we were doing something right. So I will end on the note to please take care of yourselves. Thank you.